From the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, this is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Arthur L. Bloomfield Professor and Chair of Medicine at Stanford University.
Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University on Medscape Cardiology and the Heart.org. During the course of COVID, we've tried to talk about some of the science that's going on, some of the other things people might be doing, like writing, to relieve some of the stress of COVID. But perhaps one of the most important topics of COVID is what we're going to discuss today. And that is, in the midst of a global pandemic, how do you do the high quality clinical research that's required under great stress in the healthcare system, under great individual stress of clinicians, investigators, and patients, to try to answer the questions that we need answered, which is, what do we do? And so I can't imagine a better guest to have with me today, Martin Landray from Oxford. Professor Landray is a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Oxford University. And I'm pleased to say he's one of my friends who I can refer to as Sir Landray, and it be a proper title. So Martin, thank you for joining us here today on the Heart.org, and thanks for lending your expertise, and maybe most of all, a genuine thank you from the clinical community for the contributions, which have been extraordinary coming out of your work over the last 18 plus months.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm just sorry I can't actually be there in person. It seems a long time since I've been to the States, and believe me, I'm missing it.
Well, we're all missing you. I remember early in the pandemic, we had you do medical grand rounds here at Stanford when you had the first trial results with Dexamethasone. And people still talk about that as one of the best grand rounds we've had throughout the pandemic, because it made people realize that you can do high quality clinical investigation in the midst of all the turmoil, in the midst of all the stress. And those are the kind of lessons I want to get to today. But let's start at the beginning. You said you've not been to the States. I've not been to visit my friends in Europe. One of my great disappointments the last few years is missing one of my favorite meetings of the year, which is the European Society of Cardiology meetings. Always a great meeting, always held in great cities. And so tell us, how are things going in the UK?
Well, we're in an odd state right now, I'd say. Vaccination rates, particularly in the adult and particularly in the elderly community, are really very high. I'm not sure what exactly the official statistics are, but probably well over 80% in the at-risk groups double vaccinated. So that has been really very encouraging. Now, of course, we recognize that those vaccines are imperfect. A vaccine even that has 90% success has 10% failure. So, one in 10 people will go on and get COVID. But what we are seeing is that the impact of that COVID is much less severe. And so the number of people going into hospital and the number of people dying from COVID is dramatically less than it was previously. But it's, as we would call it, the autumn here. I guess you call it the fall. And the timing of this year's waxing and waning of the epidemic is such that we sort of came out of lockdown in, I guess, May time perhaps, and now here we are heading back into school, heading back into college. Today is in fact the first day that I've been back at the Wellcome Trust building in central London in 18 months. So the last time I caught the number 18 bus was the time that I was stood on that bus with Jeremy Farrar saying we better get a trial up and running in a fortnight, and that became the recovery trial. So we're back, heading indoors. And so the questions are threefold. One is what will happen as we head indoors with regards to COVID and of course, the worries about future variants potentially. One is the huge backlog on the NHS and the health service for all the other things that the NHS should be doing, but hasn't frankly had time or capacity to do over the last 18 months. And the third is, and what's going to happen to seasonal influenza this year? And I think everybody's bracing themselves for what could be a nasty influenza outbreak on top of those other two factors. So we're not out of the woods, and we should be mindful of that. But large-scale vaccination has been really important here. I'd just like to take one reflection, given we're talking about compare and contrast different parts of the world. And I think we really do have to recognize that whilst the US and the UK and one or two other places have access to huge quantities of vaccine, many places do not. So in in the UK and the US, it's a luxury to turn down the vaccine. I mean, it's in my view not sensible, but it's a luxury to even have that option. In many parts of the world, simply don't have that option. And the real worry is the damage that does to the health and economy in those places, but also that that's where the variants are going to come from. That's where the thing's going to come up and bite us from. And so if you like, giving vaccines overseas to the international community is actually a selfish act as well as a generous act. And I think we really need to look at that. And of course, just in the last few days, there have been big announcements from your president and our prime minister and many others about this. But big announcements are great. We actually have to see action, and that really, really is important. As I say, for selfish reasons as well as for humanitarian reasons.
Well, you've brought up a lot of directions we could go, and certainly the notion that you said of the mass vaccination rates in the UK certainly contrasts with the US, where overall we have a high vaccination rate, but it's very heterogeneous. Where I live in Northern California, the two counties that surround Stanford University, it makes up our primary population that we care for, has an exceedingly high vaccination rate. There are parts of the American South where I used to live, which are really quite low in terms of their adult vaccination rate. In the US, it's become, as you've undoubtedly read, a political issue as opposed to a medical issue. And that's been one of the sad lessons of the pandemic. On the vaccination, we were pleased this week. We know, as part of a global community, and people like you and I spend a lot of time around the globe, none of us are safe if the entire world is not safe. And I like how you've said it. It's not just a humanitarian effort. It is actually a self-preservation effort, that you have to be able to vaccinate the globe if we're all going to be safe. We started our mass vaccinations for flu shots this week at our institution, and recognizing that it's going to be, it may be potentially a tough winter if we can't get ahead of flu vaccinations. Well, Martin, let's talk about recovery, and I like how you gave the intro. Riding on the bus and saying we've got to get a trial going. Was that really how it started? You were just brainstorming about what can we as clinical investigators do?
Well, I've got a part-time role, a seconded role here at the Wellcome Trust, actually for the last couple of years, trying to help sort out what good regulatory guidance should be around clinical trials, so-called good clinical practice, which everybody knows is not good, not clinical, not practical. And that's what one of the themes of my work over the last, well, I say couple of years, actually the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
And that's why I was coming to London at the time. But it was the 28th of February last year. The outbreak had been and gone largely in China. It had been and gone mostly in Iran, both sort of, if you like, other people's problems. If you look, it's to sort of coin a rather an unfortunate, but I think probably common sentiment. Then in northern Italy, and I wrote to Jeremy Farrar, who I know well, and said, the PS at the bottom of the email, and said, people are talking about social distancing, they're talking about travel restrictions, and all these other things. I said, at some point, people are going to start talking about interventions to treat or to prevent the worst consequences of this disease. And I said, is anybody thinking about randomization? And I said, if we're not careful, drugs will get thrown at people in hope and expectation, and at the end of it, we'll be none the wiser about which ones benefited and which ones did not. And in fact, now is precisely the time to be setting up randomized trials. It's exactly at the times when there's huge public health need. There are bad outcomes. There are no knowledge of meaningful treatments, that actually people are prepared to innovate and be flexible, and that randomized trials could actually deliver solutions. And pretty much all of that was in that first email right at the end of February last year. And then he wrote back immediately and said, you and Peter Horby better start talking to each other. We did the following week. He's the co-lead on the recovery trial. And then it was that Monday morning, the 9th of March, 2020, Jeremy Farrar and I were on the bus between the train station and the Wellcome Trust building, comparing notes about that Northern Italy outbreak. And Jeremy turned to me and he said, this is going to come to the UK in a tsunami in a fortnight. We've got to get a trial up and running in that time. I came into the offices where I am now, and started making the phone calls. And 9 days later, the first patient was recruited into the trial.
That's nothing short of extraordinary in terms of the rapidity with which it happened. And I'm going to get into some of the details of what were the key elements of the UK system that allowed that to happen. As you know, that our research system in the US is so decentralized. In some ways, that's great. And I think it's particularly great for discovery science, but it's not so great when one is faced with a pandemic and you need large scale trials set up quickly. But let me ask you maybe a more specific question. How did you pick dexamethasone as the first thing that you wanted to study? What was the aha moment that led to that?
Well, I mean, all of these things are, they're a punt, they're a bet, aren't they? With every drug we've studied in this trial, and frankly in every trial I've ever done, you hope it works. You've got good reasons for thinking it might work. That's why you put it in the trial in the first place. But you don't know it works, and that's why you actually do the trial. And the WHO had done a big filtering process. A government committee here in the UK had done a big filtering process, and they got down to a list of, I don't know, 80 odd drugs. So it wasn't that much of a filtering process, frankly, but some were bobbling along at the top and kept coming back. Lopinavir was one, remdesivir was another, and dexamethasone actually had been proposed as a possible treatment for a flu pandemic or a flu outbreak. The evidence has seesawed for dexamethasone. You're suppressing the immune system, you're right, suppressing inflammation, pros and cons, all sorts of funny data have come out over the years. There wasn't a robust answer. So we picked up this flu protocol, and it was unworkable. It was unworkable. It was the right question in flu. Turns out it's the right question in COVID, but the protocol is impractical. And anybody can design a protocol that won't work. The question is, how do you design a protocol that really will work? And in some ways, the luxury, that's maybe an unfortunate word, but just to go with me for a minute, the academic or intellectual luxury of that particular time was that one could actually take the dramatic step change in thought process and say, what do we really need to know? What do we really need to do? Can we imagine what this is going to be like on the coalface? The hospitals are overloaded. The doctors and nurses have no time at all. They're emotionally overloaded. They're exhausted. The patients are often elderly. They're scared. Many of them just can't even breathe for themselves, and they're alone because of social distancing and infection control. The phrase war zone is overused, but it was a very helpful sort of thought process that, what are we going to do if we were to get a tsunami of cases like happened in northern Italy, where frankly, they were queuing up for the mortuary, let alone queuing up for the beds.
Oh, really, early on, the stories of
really difficult decisions about who to put on a ventilator,
yep,
who to take
triage,
off the
etc.
ventilator.
Yep.
So you can't think in normal ways. That's, as I say, it's sort of liberating in the sense that you have to think differently if you're going to make this work. Frankly, we should be thinking differently all the time, but it did give us that moment.
That's what I want to get at, Martin. You said something that struck me at the beginning. You said, well, this wasn't a couple of years worth of work, this decades worth of work. And you and I have both worked in large scale trials for decades. And they're hard to do, as you know, and they're hard to get up and going. They're hard to keep going. The 9 days, I find nothing short of extraordinary in terms of an accomplishment. There can sometimes be this tension between clinicians on the front lines who are trying everything they can to treat a patient to keep them alive, and clinician investigators who may be doing some of the same, but are also spending some of our time thinking about, as you said, what's really the right way to test what works. And sometimes there can be a tension between those two groups. I suspect you had to make a lot of phone calls to people to say, hey, we want you to do this. We want you to enroll your patients. Was it a difficult sell, or is the UK ethos different than the American ethos?
Well, the first thing about motivating people to take part in, well, basically the hypothesis, like the story is, we want to make it as easy to randomize people in the trial as it is to prescribe these drugs arbitrarily, willy-nilly. Randomize and learn versus just distribute the drug to probably roughly half the people and learn nothing, and continue to make the same, to make mistakes. I mean, you will be continuing to make mistakes, but it's all very well saying that stuff, but it has to be simple. It has to be doable in these circumstances. And in these circumstances, that meant it had to be almost frictionless. Couldn't remove absolutely everything, but anything that we could, we removed. And I was actually minded of the, when I was a very junior doctor, and actually before that, when I was a medical student, the trial that made me want to do trials. And that was the ISIS-2 trial of streptokinase versus not, and aspirin versus not. And the results are well known, and the impact is well known, and there have been other trials in the US and elsewhere, and it led to, frankly, the whole field of big cardiovascular trials. It led to primary PCI. I mean, there are just whole areas of medicine and therapeutics came off the back of that. But it was famously a single-page case report form. It was famously that the protocol was, I think, 8 pages. The clinic manual was one piece of A5 paper, so half a piece of paper folded in 2, deliberately designed so that it would fit into the top coat, the breast pocket of a doctor's white coat, and the name ISIS-2 would stick out the top, basically saying randomize me out of the top. I mean, it was really, that's quality by design. And it seemed to, and I remember being that trial, I looked at the results and it was beautiful, but I also looked at that trial and thought, somewhere there are about a handful of people sitting in a sort of a temporary building on the car park of the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, who one day came into work and said, not only is this question important, but we're actually going to recruit 18,000 people, and this is how we're going to do it. And that's what actually got me really into trials all the way back then. And so I had that protocol on my desk. I had Salim Youssef, Richard Peter, and Rory Collins's paper on why we need some large, simple trials on my desk. And I went from there. And I said, look, actually, what is it that we need this time round? From a blank piece of paper, what do we need to write down? Let's only write down the things that we absolutely must.
But how did you get people? So I get all that, and I too, like you, we're around the same age, was very excited by those trials coming out of Italy, GC, out of the UK, ISIS. I was a fellow at Duke during the Gusto days. Even Gusto, which was large and simple, was only a 3-page case report form, and hundreds of manuscripts were then written from those 3 pages. So I get all that. But in the US, we are so decentralized with regard to our ability to do things. People would worry about, well, who's going to get credit for this? Is my university going to get credit for this? Where's the grant going to sit? The politics of clinical research in the US slow things down tremendously. Why doesn't that happen in the UK? Is it the national health system and a feeling of responsibility? What's the difference?
Well, believe me, there's health politics and academic envy and so on in the UK, just as there is in any other part of the planet. I mean, that's no different. And and there are wise people who wrote to the MHRA and said you shouldn't be allowing this trial of dexamethasone because it's dangerous to suppress the immune system and you'll kill people. I mean, I've got those letters, and
well, that's good. If everybody thought it was a good idea, it's probably not a good idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But no, we were able to. I mean, so number one, we did convince the chief medical officer that of 2 things. One was doing the trial should be seen as part of routine clinical care. Not only do we convince the chief medical officer, who has an R&D background, but we also convinced the chief medical officer for the NHS that doing the trial was to be considered part of clinical care. And secondly, we said that for some of these treatments, hydroxychloroquine is the best example. It's not to be used outside the context of the clinical trial. We're not going to reimburse, we're not going to allow the use of hydroxychloroquine. We have, we had huge stockpiles of it here in the UK. I mean, there must have been tons of the stuff sitting in some warehouse somewhere. But rather than just say, oh, it's there, go use it, we said, actually, it's there. And if you want to access it, it's part of the randomization and we'll learn. And I think it was 84 days later, we knew the answer. In this context, it's useless. But, that's an important part of the way of doing it. But we did have to motivate the frontline clinicians. We did have to motivate the patients, motivate the doctors and nurses and pharmacists and so on. And part of that was building a community spirit around it. So we took a very deliberate approach of transparency. The recruitment numbers are all up on the website. Every regulatory submission, every IRB submission is up on the website. Every bit of training material is up on the website. The patient information is up on the website. Anybody can look at it. You can look at it now.
I have.
if you're fed up listening to me, you can go look that stuff up. And so that created transparency, and we took the media with us. And we said to them, look, actually, there is this issue, and I recognize it as a doctor myself. And previously looking after sick patients in my younger years, the help me doctor, please help me, from a breathless patient is incredibly powerful. But helping is not the same as prescribing. And prescribing a drug where you have frankly no idea whether it's going to do good or harm or nothing is not doing your patient in front of you any favors, or the next one, or the one after that, or the ones in the next ward, or the next hospital, the next county, or the next country. You've got to randomize and learn. Do it fast, do it at scale, learn the lessons. And one of the things you and I have talked about before, thinking about, perhaps a year ago, last fall, was, the US has huge numbers of cases. That's bad. We all wish that wasn't the case. But if the ability with everything it lined up to actually answer these sorts of questions in a matter of days or weeks is absolutely there. Take convalescent plasma as a great example. Instead of just giving it to 100,000 people and in a sort of and collecting some simple data. I mean, that was a beautiful, large-scale, simple, non-randomized study. And for the sake of a coin toss, that answer would have been got about last July, possibly last August. We'd have known that answer. You'd have beaten us to it. I wouldn't have minded at all. We just needed the answer.
Yeah, both you.
I nearly put the coin in the post and sent it over, so that somebody had could toss it.
Yeah, well, I think we both agree that there's a role for observation, but observation shouldn't be the role for understanding therapeutics. Observation should be the role for creating hypotheses that are worthy to be tested. And so some convalescent plasma observations is worthwhile, but I agree with you. I think it was an egregious use of resources to have basically given this to tens of thousands of individuals without randomization. I'm of the mindset, Martin, that, and I've said this before, that clinicians should really only be making two broad categories of decisions. When the data is known and clear, the system should help us enforce doing it. Aspirin to the acute MI patient might be an example. When the answer is not known, and that's the great amount of things we do with therapeutics, we should be studying it, and we should be studying it in a rational way, which is randomization, not in a way where people, as you've said, willy-nilly pick what they want to do, and ultimately it gets randomly distributed, but that's not the same as randomization.
Yeah, no, I mean, in both cases, you're trying it to see what happens. The difference between randomization and non-randomization is in randomization, you actually learn what happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Non-randomization, you just continue to kid yourself. But to be clear, if a treatment has a massive effect, benzyl penicillin for bacterial meningitis, you don't need randomization. It's such a great big effect that you've only got to treat 3 kids like that, and you just know it works. And insulin for type 1 diabetics and so on. But there are frankly precious few treatments that are actually like that. When someone comes and shows you one that they think is like that, be very, very skeptical. The alarm bell should ring every time you see a big effect size as to, is this really real? Because there's a strong touch of used car salesman in that stuff.
Well,
but otherwise you have to randomize. And so a really big question I think going forwards is, why do we make it so darn hard to do a randomized trial? By comparison, with, either undertreating or overtreating. You can consider it as being harming at least some of the patients, either the ones you treat or the ones you don't, patients without any controls at all. That's a mad system. And the word trial does not mean risk. Uninformed clinical care is darn risky. Actually, randomize and learn is a very, very smart way of making improvements in therapeutics.
Well, this is a whole other topic you and I could come back to, that there's as you know, and your remarks touch upon it, within the bioethics community, there's a big debate as to rethinking the whole notion of informed consent, because allowing doctors to just pick what they think might be best without randomization with the intent to learn may actually be unethical. And so, but that's a tough argument to have. There are groups in the United States that are having that discussion, having that argument now. One of my favorite trials comes out of the UK, which was HEAT PCI, which I thought was a fantastic trial of 2 different types of anticoagulants during primary PCI. And they determined that they had equipoise in their practice, and they just randomized everybody, gave people information after. But what an efficient way to do research on well-known therapies that people were using, as you say, randomly, but not through randomization.
Yeah, I mean, I realize we'd like to be talking about cardiovascular medicine, but I think there's a lot that cardiovascular medicine can learn from COVID. But a very neat example is, think about all the controversy around what should the interval be between the first and second dose of the vaccine. But back at Christmas, the UK government said, look, we're going to just do first doses first and push the second doses out to 12 weeks. We said, well, you know what, you could do a trial in which you randomize people as to whether they get their first doses at 12 weeks or at 3 weeks. And some people said, that's great, but you need consent. And we said, hang on a minute, we need consent to bring people back at 3 weeks, which is the licensed dose, but we don't need consent in order to push it out to 12 weeks right, on the basis of the government decision. That's bonkers. Yeah. But that trial, we could, we put the protocol together. We could have randomized 1 million people for £1 million for 1 year of follow-up to actually understand whether there were pros and cons, and there were good reasons to thinking both in the short term and the long term, of 12 weeks versus 3 weeks. The same is exactly true of who should get a third boost, a third dose, a booster dose, now or later. These are examples of very simple questions where there's basically no additional risk above what we know already, but where the value of that information would be colossal. And it gets slightly off topic, but
no. I think it's very much on topic.
The point is that randomization, I think, can make massive differences to actually really understanding what one's doing. And because of scale, COVID is the only differences between COVID and cardiovascular disease, apart from biology, I'll leave that aside, but essentially that our timing and profile. In COVID, all timelines were squashed.
Yeah, they were
compressed. I know we set this trial up in 9 days, but you would see thousands of cases per day by comparison with thousands of cases per week or per month in cardiovascular disease. You would see evolution in science, in therapeutics, in testing, and all these other things in a period of days and weeks, where normally it would be, well, actually it would be years and decades. So time was one feature, and the second was profile, and that's that COVID was on every page of every newspaper, on every website, a little ticker tape of the number of cases and the number of deaths and all of those other things. It was in every conversation. It was part of everybody's mindset. So the profile was high. Cardiovascular disease, continues as the sort of hidden juggernaut. I mean, it's not so hidden. It's there, but it's not the thing that you really notice.
Well, the fact in the US that mortality is increasing from cardiovascular disease, or at least the decline is decreased. So it's slow. The progress we've made over the decades has slowed for a variety of reasons. It's my final question for you, Martin, is the construct of recovery, is it applicable to the chronic diseases of hypertension, diabetes, obesity, lack of physical activity. You pick the topic that you and I deal with daily clinically. Is the recovery platform appropriate for that?
Yes, broadly. I don't think every trial needs to look exactly the same. In fact, it definitely shouldn't look exactly the same. Not every trial needs to be a platform, but randomization is part of clinical care. If you don't know what you're doing, randomize so that you learn what you should be doing. Access to data so that you can find out what happens to the people that you're studying. Involvement of the patients and the clinical community, so that you're doing it in partnership. You're doing it with people, not to people. And national policy making, which actually is aligned with that overall method of improve. And one final thing is, what's the biggest barrier to actually doing a lot of these things? In my view, a huge barrier is the burden of not only regulation, but the way that regulation is interpreted and applied and inspected, not just by regulators. It's easy to point the finger at the FDA or the MHRA, but actually by all of our institutions. Think of the additional burdens that your IRB places. Think about just, Zeke Emanuel did that lovely paper that said that the average word count for the vaccine trial consent forms was 8,000 words, would take you 40 minutes to read it. And you had to be a sort of undergraduate English student in order to actually be able to comprehend it. I mean, that's just nonsense. Yeah, and yet you could, the burden of regulation is a real significant barrier. Anything that makes it harder to randomize and learn, we've got to look at that really, really carefully. I think that's a major thing we have to focus on next.
I like the concept, which in some ways is simple, in some ways is very complex, which is that a central tenet of medical practice needs to be taught from the very beginning, which is when you don't know, randomize so you can learn. And I think you're spot on. And somehow there needs to be a cultural change that is become the accepted practice. The other thing that we're struggling with in the US, which you've gotten at, which is this notion of alignment of the science with the policymakers. And in some ways in the US, we've really separated over the decades public health from medical care. And in order to have good public policy, you need them both working in alignment.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the NHS has really woken up to this. Instead of being a consumer of the products of R&D, it is actually a partner in the R&D process itself. And I think that can apply to any healthcare system. Instead of just waiting for somebody else to develop the next stent or the next antithrombotic or whatever it might be, actually, why don't we work out whether actually we even need another stent or another antithrombotic? And if we do, what do we need to know about it? And what's the pricing point? And what will that mean for access? And what will that mean for disparities and so on and so forth? So moving the healthcare system to be a partner, not merely a post hoc consumer of R&D, is a really important part of this. And on the academic side, we've got to think bigger than individuals. It's easy to talk about team science. The thing is to do it. 4,000 doctors, nurses, pharmacists up and down every hospital in the country, in the UK, have taken part in COVID. The sort of headline number, I don't completely believe it, but let's use it for the moment, is that dexamethasone has saved 1 million lives around the world. You divide 1 million by 4,000 and then work out how many lives each of those individual pharmacists and frontline doctors and nurses and whatever have contributed to saving. Now think of what they could have done if they'd all gone their own way and done their own thing, which is the classic academic model. So teamwork really means collaboration and looking at the big picture and the big impact. And one of the things I have been at pains to do, Peter Horby, my colleague, also, is this is not the Horby and Landray show. This is not a 1 or 2 man band. This is a whole system effort, including those frontline doctors and nurses, and including over 43,000 patients and their families. And we can't conclude this discussion without mentioning the patients. This is impossible without them, and this is absolutely for them. And when we see in COVID, but also in heart disease, we see data and numbers and statistics and ticker tape of how many hospitalizations and how many deaths and so on. Remember, every number is a person, is a family, and sadly for many, many is a tragedy. So we do this with patients, with their families, for patients, for their families.
Well, you know, Martin, that's a great way to end the conversation, because there is this notion of the citizen scientists, and that's what those 43,000 individuals were or are. They've contributed. And, you know, maybe that there's a, you know, we always talk about NNT and NNH. Maybe we should talk about a statistic of the lives saved by investigator. And the dexamethasone example is a great one to that those 4,000 individuals should take great pride and credit. And I give you a lot of credit, because yes, it is a team effort, but the team needs a leader. And yes, everybody refers to it as recovery, but it doesn't happen without a leader. So congratulations. Martin, I could talk all day to you. This is a fun conversation. You've done extraordinary work and good things for the globe. So thank you. And thanks for joining me here on the Heart.org and Medscape Cardiology.
Thank you very much for having me.